the silk curtain trembled. Behind it, a single woman sat in absolute darkness, listening to the voices of ministers arguing in the outer chamber. It was 1861. The Chinese Empire was collapsing. Foreign armies had burned the summer palace. The treasury was empty. And the only person with the authority to stop the chaos was a 26-year-old former concubine whom nobody in the room could see. How did she get here? And how did she manage to rule China from behind a curtain for the next 47 years? Her name was Yehonala. She was born in 1835 into a Manchu family of minor nobility. Not wealthy, not powerful, but educated. When she came of age, like thousands of girls in the empire, she entered the Forbidden City as a concubine, one of countless women competing for the emperor's attention. The odds of becoming anything more were brutal. Most concubines lived their entire lives in the palace, invisible and forgotten. But Yehonala was different. She was intelligent. She was calculating. And she had something the other concubines did not: the ability to read and understand the politics of power. When the Xianfeng emperor finally chose her as his consort, she gave him what no other woman could: a son. In 1856, she bore him an heir. Everything changed. A woman who produced a male heir was no longer disposable. She was essential. She became the Empress Mother. But power in the Forbidden City was never simple. When the Xianfeng emperor died in 1861, his son was only 5 years old. The throne was vacant. The empire was vacant. Foreign powers circled like wolves. Inside the palace, 8 regents appointed to rule jointly were paralyzed by infighting, each protecting their own interests while China burned. Court historians would later note that this was the moment the empire could have collapsed entirely. Instead, Yehonala made a choice. She orchestrated what became known as the Xinyu coup, a palace coup so carefully planned that no one saw it coming until it was too late. She allied herself with another powerful woman, the Empress consort, and together they outmaneuvered the 8 regents. She imprisoned them. She had some executed. Then she declared herself regent for her young son, and she sat behind that silk curtain, out of sight, where no official could accuse her of violating the ancient rules that forbade women from direct rule. If she remained hidden, she remained legitimate. If she remained legitimate, she remained in power. For the next 3 decades, Yehonala, now known as the Empress Dowager Cixi, was the most powerful person in China. She could not attend court meetings openly. She could not sign documents with her own name. But every decision made in the empire first passed through that curtain. Ministers learned to speak in coded language, knowing she was listening. Her son, the Tongji emperor, became a puppet. When he died under mysterious circumstances at 21, she simply put her nephew on the throne and continued ruling. Historians have never agreed on whether she poisoned her son or whether it was natural illness. But they agree on one thing: Cixi removed anyone who threatened her control. She murdered rivals. She exiled reformers. She made enemies of every powerful faction in the court. And yet, she survived. While emperors came and went, Cixi remained. She became the longest reigning female ruler in Chinese history, and virtually nobody outside the palace knew her name. But as Cixi's power deepened, China deteriorated. While Japan, Korea, and Western powers modernized their armies and navies, Cixi spent the imperial treasury on building a lavish summer palace to replace the one the British had burned. When reformers begged her to embrace new technologies, railways, telegraphs, modern military training, she refused. She saw modernity as a threat to the old order that had kept her in power. In 1898, a group of young scholars called the 100 Days Reform tried to push the Tongji emperor toward modernization. Cixi had them arrested. The ringleaders were executed. The reform movement died within months. China fell further behind. The Boxer Rebellion of 1899 exposed how weak the empire had become. Foreign armies invaded Beijing. The Forbidden City itself was breached. Cixi fled in disguise, and she watched as the very palace she had once controlled absolutely crumbled under foreign gunfire. When she returned, she was still in power, but the world had changed. She could no longer hide behind a curtain. She could no longer pretend the empire was strong. Cixi died in 1908, at 73 years old. She had ruled China for nearly 5 decades. The empire she left behind was bankrupt, humiliated, and on the brink of revolution. Within 3 years of her death, the Qing dynasty would collapse. The imperial system itself would vanish. Modern historians have argued fiercely about Cixi's legacy. Some have portrayed her as a ruthless despot who clung to power at the expense of her nation. Others have argued she was a pragmatist, trying to preserve stability in an impossible situation. But most agree on this. She was never the bumbling, superstitious woman that Western newspapers painted her to be. She was calculating, intelligent, and politically masterful. She simply made a choice. She chose preservation of power over transformation of the empire. And in doing so, she ruled China longer than almost anyone in history, all from behind a silk curtain that nobody was allowed to pull back. Today, her portrait hangs in museums across the world. Tourists point at her stern, painted face and ask, "Who was that woman?" They do not remember her name. They do not know she ruled an empire from the shadows. They only know that somewhere in China's history, a concubine became a phantom ruler. And by the time the world finally saw her face clearly, it was far too late to understand what she had done.